In New London, Connecticut, there's a place called the Transportation Center where we have the Amtrak train station. There's a ferry that goes to Long Island, and also there's a bus station there. So that's why it's called the Transportation Center. And it is located in a beautiful place by the Thames River. When we look at it in a close up, from the train station, which is the building that you see in the little mark from the Google Maps, um, you actually walk outside the train station, you cross the train tracks, and you get to the city pier of New London. But you can actually take a very nice walk around the harbor walk, and from the point, that vantage point that I'm showing, I had a really very nice view of the edge of the pier and the back. This is what I mean. It was a cloudy day, and I took the picture. I really liked the composition, especially because I saw the Eagle Coast Guard ship. It's a tall sail ship that's beautiful. And it just looked against the horizon very nice, and I really liked it. It's just the particular day was overcast, and so I did not have a lot of differences in contrast on light. So I had to decide if I was going to do that, how to make it up, which is difficult. So I did a quick, view of the area. I took a photo and then I decided I was going to paint it. So the composition that I was seeing that I really liked this image was basically the eagle at the back end. It's right in the middle, so I positioned it slightly different in my canvas. The shape on the right is just simplify. It's a large, dark shape. I didn't want to go into details when I did the painting because otherwise it really takes the narrative outside from the canvas, and it should be really be bringing you in to the tall ship in the back. The vertical element of that pylon, in my mind, makes a very good compositional anchor on the vertical end, whereas the other vertical element I did not like. I thought it was too distracting. I tried seeing if I could include it or not, and I decided to exclude it from the painting. Now, to do this painting, I used water-soluble oils. I have the set of Artisan Winsor Newton. I've been very happy working with them. And I have a big tube of white, titanium white. I also have their linseed oil. And I also have other colors, but this particular Christmas, I gave myself a gift from Jerry's Artarama. I tried the LUKAS Berlin kit. Now, this LUKAS Berlin set comes with lemon yellow, cadmium yellow hue, yellow ochre, vermilion hue, alizarin crimson hue, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, the viridian hue, and burnt umber. It's a very nice set of colors. And as you can see, I place them in what I use for my oil palette is actually a very inexpensive plastic palette I got from Amazon. I think it was about $5. And you can close it up, but you can also hold it. The current photo shows the Berlin set on top of the different wells that I have to make the different mixes. But what I really like, it's not that difficult to clean from the oils. At least these water-soluble oils are very easy to clean. It's very easy to make my mixes on the different areas and keep the dark or the lights or the different colors separate from each other. And I can carry it. It's really not heavy, and it does have a hole for your thumb, so you can hold it also when you're painting. So I can use it on my studio on the surface of my table, or I can actually also hold it close to the painting when I'm painting. So that's the one I used, is a plastic palette. And in between sessions of painting, I realized that when you close it up, it's not really tight enough. So I use the Masterson Stay Wet palette for the oils, the one that doesn't have the sponge, the blue lid. And that kept the paint really in very good condition for painting several sessions, several different days. So I used a white cotton canvas that was stretched. It's 18 by 24 inches. I had previously toned with phthalo green and yellow ochre. It's what you can see on the area that now is sort of the sky. That's the way the whole canvas was before I started. Now, what I do is when I finish a painting and I have leftover paints, I tone canvases. So it's not the same as having a base that's wet and wet. This had been toned probably last year. We are now in April of 2019. So the tone was dry and I couldn't, lift it up. But I do a very, very light wash. It's just to take away the white of the canvas. I first applied the thin layer, you can see it dripping in there, of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. And it's water thin. It's the advantage of these water soluble oils. You don't need spirits, you don't need thinners, even if they are odorless. It doesn't mean that you're not smelling the gases. But I really prefer to use with water based. It's healthier and it's also very easy to maintain your brushes clean and the palette clean because you just need to use water. So this is a water thinned, very light layer where I was going to put the water. I used more of a purplish color. And I also did use more of the alizarin crimson, maybe just a little touch of the blue, very watered down to place the horizon and also place some of the shapes. So note that the area what I wanted to put the Coast Guard Eagle ship is just a block that has basically sort of the size of it, but I did not want to draw it with this background color because my idea was to paint it with negative painting when I painted the sky. I did position the pylon because I thought it was an important element, also with the same kind of mix, less diluted. And I added a little bit darker for the front using the ultramarine blue and burnt umber, but again, very water thin because this is sort of the first layer just to block in. And I remember that, shape that I wanted to keep in mind of the building and the pier in general for the composition. So this is what I meant by sort of doing some negative painting. I should have waited probably before starting to add the lights, but I was very eager to see how this was going to work. So I made a very light mixture, starting to use the titanium white, the opaques. I think it was too early, but I placed the ship there with the masts and I wanted to make sure it was going to work. And then I actually moved on working on darkening a little bit on the pylons because they were going to be um, highlighted by the light in the back. And also, I defined the building with more of the shapes. And I think I got a little bit carried away. There were some boats in the boatyard. Mostly they were blue. There was one of them that was kind of a creamy color. And even though I did not want to put a lot of, details on the building, and it's really just sort of little tiny pieces of color, like Jessica Henry uses to say. And if you haven't watched her YouTube videos, I highly recommend her. She's a great teacher. And she says, just placing small little, pieces of color. But I think at the end, it's too detailed. So you will see how I will be working on them. So at this point, I stopped myself. I did not like it, and I went back to seeing what was it from the first photo that I had that I really liked. So in this particular um, drawing or first stage, I didn't know where the focal point was. I completely lost it. I was putting way too much detail in the boats in the boatyard and in the building, and the composition was just not making any sense. And I had to remember, what did I like about the view? I spent a lot of time, a lot of days in New London when I used to live nearby, and I used the train station a lot. And this was a view that I really liked. So I had lost completely what was it that I liked about the composition. And also the perspective was wrong. I realized that I tend to do that, and I see that a lot of people, a lot of beginning uh, amateur painters, we all do the same. We tend to bring up the things we're seeing because we are being cognitive about what we see instead of forgetting that we are seeing a boatyard. We should just really paint what we see. So I had to correct that perspective. It was more on my eye level, and I was actually trying to paint it as if I had been flying and looking at that boatyard from above. So I corrected several things at this step. The focal point, I made sure that I wanted to accentuate that. And the way to do that is using cerulean blue, titanium white, and a bit of lemon yellow in the water reflections around the pylon. So I was painting, negatively painting around the areas that would be dark. And I wanted to make sure I remembered also that the light behind the tall ship was going to bring the tall ship also to attention. But that vertical line of the pylon is what I really wanted to have the eye being brought there with the narrative of the painting. Now the perspective is corrected. I did put that at eye level, and I had to paint on top of what I had before. Now, because I had done a wider triangle, as I mentioned, is as if I had been flying a bit and looking at it from the top. The problem is that I had been using a lot of titanium white and the cadmium yellows, and those are not transparent paints, whereas the ultramarine blue and the alizarin crimson that I normally use for the dark are transparent. So I had to use a lot more of these dark, including with burnt umber, to cover all the white that I had been using for the boats. So again, if I had done my sketch ahead of time, maybe I wouldn't have made that mistake when I was painting. But it's good that you can actually correct yourself. A little bit more difficult with oils than acrylics because they dry very fast compared to the oils, but the oils are also good. I just want to also to make you note that when I put the reflections, you can see it's a very, very quick motion of my brush. It's just a brush stroke to say I have to remind myself these are areas that are going to be light. And with the buildings, you can see the boats have actually almost disappeared. I just wanted to use some cool grays, insinuating that there's something in there, but I do not want to distract attention from the focal point by putting a lot of details that would draw the eye of the viewer towards those details. And now the size of the mass of the pier is better. It was way too big. And as you can notice there, the turret was too high, even though it doesn't seem that it's too high for the perspective that was very, very tall. So now I corrected all those things in this next step before continuing the actual painting. So then I continued working a bit more on the sky. So I did mix different piles, as you can see with using the palette that I have, which is also for watercolors, but it works very, very well for these water soluble oils. I had different piles with very similar tones, where I had more of the yellow, more of the pinks, more of the greenish or turquoise, and more of the violets for the sky. And I just positioned a little bit more on the sky, and I did negative painting on the masses of the land in the back, and also for the Coast Guard Eagle ship. So I decided to work a bit more on the sky. And one thing that I noticed is that I really liked sort of the light area behind the mass of the building. I thought it was nice to have that contrast, and I kept in mind that I wanted to keep a little bit of a lighter color of the sky, especially around the areas that I thought would be interesting that define those shapes by the contrast of placing them against the lighter sky. That goes also for the focal point, especially that pylon in the middle with its reflection. I thought it would make a very nice, interesting story that the this particular painting is telling us. By taking this pylon, you I think the eye goes immediately to the Coast Guard ship, which is very interesting. It's coming into the harbor far away near the area. This is now going to the south, more of the area around the south of New London. Now, I worked a bit more on the water mass, and this is very much something that I like to do a lot. So I mixed different piles in this case with darker tones and lighter tones, but basically ultramarine blue. I did use a lot of the viridian hue because the water brings that greenish color, and I like that. I used burnt umber, which is a warm dark. So when I want to darken something that I also want to bring the warmth to it, I use a bit more of the burnt umber rather than ultramarine blue, which would make it cooler. And I also used a little bit of the alizarin crimson to bring some violet tones in it. But what I wanted to let you know is at this stage, I'm using the direction of the strokes also to bring the focal point sort of a radial. I think that there's like an X shape in this painting that's bringing us to the area where the Coast Guard and the pylon are, and it's all directing your eye, the clouds, the building from the right to the left, and then the waves are also going to be directing the eye. These waves are completely made up. They were not like that day, and the colors of the skies are also my invention. I did work a bit more on the pier building. As you can see, the turret now is lower. It has a little bit more definition. And I used more of, cooler pushing back the back of the buildings and also a little bit lighter in tone. Even though the turret looks like it's white, it really is gray. And I made sure that the turret was the gray, which should be, it's supposed to be a white building, but again, it really is darker than the sky. So I had to make sure that the sky was the lightest tone in the canvas. So in this next stage of the painting, having a lot of fun with the sky, I did realize that I had to put more of the directional clouds. You can start seeing them a little bit, but I worked a lot more on these directional clouds. It's basically not blending the colors. This is an oil painting, contrary to my acrylic paintings where it's very easy not to blend because they dry very fast. I have to remind myself that when I place a color, I have to just let it there, leave that brush stroke, and then move on to another area of the canvas that has the same color. And I wanted to start bringing out the pinks and the warms and the sky with these clouds and make those clouds a bit more directional. Again, going with this idea of the X shape to the center of the canvas as a focus with the lightest area in there. So with this sky color, I reshaped the Coast Guard. I did this so many times because, as you remember, I started with a shape that was the violet gray, and everything else I'm doing on that ship is negative painting. It's just painting on top of that gray, but I didn't paint the masts or the hull again. It's from the beginning. That's the way I had it. So I'm just doing like the negative painting. In the water, I worked a lot more on the water movements, and I also wanted to make sure that I could identify where the pier ended and what was reflection and what was pier structure. So I also worked a bit more on lights on the pier, a little bit of there was like a railing on that pier, and I wanted to make sure that you work on the whole canvas instead of finishing one area. you work on the whole canvas at the same time, building it up slowly, but uh, on the whole, you work on all areas so that also the colors that are on the sky are also in the water. And some of them are mixed also with the building, believe it or not. So I did use a lot of the same colors around so that there's harmony in colors in the oil painting. On the pier building, I actually was um, making sure that the turret was less, was better defined, a bit more gray. And also, I wanted to make sure I understood, the area that was receiving the light was actually notable. Now, one problem that I noticed, and this was, it took me a while, as you can see, was that the sailboat that was there, it's way too big. It's almost bigger than the Coast Guard. And that was wrong. Then I actually had to make sure that I corrected that because it was way too big. And now I realize the focal point is the light in the sky, and I wanted to make sure that I would bring that with more dramatic changes. So as you can see, the sailboat now is smaller, more to the real size that I was seeing instead of that huge, absurd sailboat in the back. Um, Now, the focal point that I wanted to bring was from the sky, and you can see now more dramatic sky colors. And I wanted to make sure, again, painted around the eagle. Every time that I changed those sky colors, I had to also go down on the water and make sure that I also reshaped the back areas with that sky color. And I wanted to make it warm. It's the reflection of the light. So for the sky, again, I mixed several piles, similar tones, titanium white with either, cerulean blue, lemon yellow, vermilion hue. I also used a little bit of burnt umber and alizarin crimson hue for the different piles. And in some cases, they were making grays areas, especially for the edges of the sky. And in some cases, you have very bright areas. And I like when you use the oils how you can start putting little splashes of color. There's no pure white on these clouds. It's just a contrast of a lighter tone, let's say pinkish tone, on top of a purplish shade that gives the impression of the light. This is what I mean by directional clouds. I decided, even though the clouds were not like that, it was an overcast day, but I didn't see the clouds like that. I wanted to make sure that I could use clouds again to bring the eye to the focus. The focal point for me is where that light is actually hitting and creating that contrast with the center pylon. Now, with the water reflections help me accentuate also the pylons and the reflections. But the problem is, in my mind, this was way too yellow on the water and I was not liking it. It was getting very pasty, so I had to actually scrape with a knife, a painting knife or palette knife, because I didn't like how I was getting it too yellow and too light too soon. But at least I had positioned the basic ideas on the painting by now. So I worked a bit more on that area. As you can see, it's less yellow and it has more of the viridian hue, and there's still, lemon yellow. So I did place a bit more of that. And I also realized that I had to extend the reflections of the water and make the shadow or the actual reflection of the pylon, the dark reflection, a bit smaller than I had it before. Because that's the way I was seeing it. There was a lot more light reflected on the water than I was actually putting in there. And this would also bring the pylon a bit better. On the pier building, I did work a lot. I don't know if you noticed, but there was a lot of what looked like white edges. Yes, the building has white edges, but I did not like the way they were distracting. and the reality is that they were actually catching the light. So the light is actually coming from the right. It's actually lighting the back of the sky, and it's actually lighting the building. So I made the colors in general lighter. I did use some shaded areas in blue, lighter blue under the awnings of the roofs, and the areas that are catching the light, I wanted to make them more like golden areas also in the turret, so that it would be more of the idea of the afternoon light. And I did lose a lot of the edges that I had originally painted that had defined the windows and the doors, etc., because to me it was too much on the edge of the painting, and it was just giving a different story from what I wanted to tell here. I just wanted a more soothing story where everything is bringing us to that ship that's coming into the harbor quietly, even though it's a stormy day. So I worked a bit more on the sky. I didn't like that particular patch of turquoise. And I actually made sure that I refined the area where the light is hitting. I did work again every time I change the area of the sky there. I continue working on the edges and negative painting of both the eagle and also the sailboat in the back. So every time I work on it, I do that. There's a greenish area on the sky. It didn't bother me. It was interesting that it came out that green, but I thought it was actually coming along in an interesting, dramatic way of how these clouds are actually directing your narrative and the eye to the pylon and to the center of where that light is actually telling us where to look for. In terms of the water, I worked a bit more on the water. I like to work on water a lot. And with oils, it gives me a lot of pleasure because with acrylics, I have to be very, very quick. With oils, I have a little more time to place the different areas of the waves and where I think the light may be catching a wave and then the shadow of the wave and make it splashy. So I did darken, by the way, a bit of the splashes on the pier, and I lightened the vertical wall of the pier. It was too dark, and now I had like vertical strokes defining that it is a vertical um, wall in there, but I made it less dark, and I worked on the water movements. Now, I also created a wave that wasn't there. I thought it was fun to create that wave coming because it would also explain the splashes on the pier and the movement of the water that I had completely made up, because it wasn't like that on the photo. It was more calm waters, but I sort of thought it was interesting that I created this wave coming in, making more splashes and creating a bit more sense of movement into the painting, which otherwise is sort of quiet in the back. This is the final version of the painting. It does have the focal point, the changes and the interest of the contrast in the light areas and the shaded areas. There's a lot of grays in the sky, and I did enjoy painting. This is an oil on canvas, 18 by 24, and it was finished by me in 2019.